Hello and welcome. I am Juliette Rizzo, and I will be talking with Ruth Ryder and Greg Kaur from the Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, about the final Part B regulations implementing the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. We'll be talking about the provisions relating to monitoring, technical assistance, and enforcement. Welcome, Ruth and Greg, and thanks for being with us today.
Hi, Juliette.
Hello, Juliette.
I understand that the requirements regarding monitoring, technical assistance, and enforcement represent the first time IDEA has specifically included these elements in the statute and implementing regulations. Is that true?
Actually, there's always been a requirement for states to exercise general supervisory responsibility. OSEP interpreted that to include monitoring, technical assistance, and enforcement. And there have been specific requirements to monitor certain elements of the law, such as least restrictive environment and the implementation of the Individualized Education Program, or IEP. And as the agency charged with administering the IDEA, OSEP has always had an obligation to see that states were implementing the statute properly. But this reauthorization represents the first specific requirements for both OSEP and states to monitor, provide technical assistance, and take enforcement actions to appropriately implement Parts C and B of the IDEA.
Are the requirements set out for OSEP different from those set out for the states?
Not really. Of course, OSEP focuses on states, and states focus on their local level programs. But the primary focus for both OSEP and the states is on improving educational results and functional outcomes and ensuring that states and public agencies meet program requirements.
And it's important to note that the statutory requirements apply to Part C programs as well. Section 642 of the statute, part of the law that covers Part C programs, indicates that these provisions apply to Part C. And Part C programs across the nation have been implementing the requirements of law just as the Part B programs have been.
Distinguish Parts B and C for us again.
Part B covers children with disabilities from ages 3 through 21, while Part C covers infants and toddlers with disabilities from birth through age 2.
So within that context, what are states required to do under these provisions?
The final regulations for Part B require that states monitor the implementation of Part B, enforce that implementation, and report annually on performance.
State enforcement includes advising the local program of available technical assistance, identifying local programs as high risk, and imposing special conditions when needed. It includes requiring local programs to prepare corrective action plans. Also, states can withhold funds.
Isn't there bound to be significant variation in the way states monitor, enforce, and report?
There are some very specific requirements in the statute and final regulations to minimize some differences in these elements.
Each state must use quantifiable indicators and such qualitative indicators as are needed to adequately measure performance in the priority areas, as well as the indicators established by the Secretary for the state performance plans.
What are these priority areas you mentioned?
There are 3 priority areas established in the statute and final regulations: the provision of a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, or LRE; state exercise of general supervision, including child find, effective monitoring, the use of resolution meetings, mediation, and a system of transition services; and disproportionate representation of racial and ethnic groups in special education and related services, when that representation is the result of inappropriate identification.
You also referred to indicators established by the Secretary. What are these?
Based on the statutory priority areas, the Department, with input from the special education community, developed a number of more specific indicators that help to quantify the more general priorities. For example, for the priority area of FAPE in the LRE, the Department established indicators addressing issues such as graduation and dropout rates, performance on statewide assessments, and percent of children in regular classes for most of the school day.
Based on these indicators, states had to develop a state performance plan and submit the plan to the Secretary for approval. The states submitted these plans in December 2005. States must review the performance plan at least once every 6 years and submit any amendments to the Secretary.
As part of its performance plan, Each state must establish measurable and rigorous targets for the indicators established by the Secretary under the priority areas. There are 20 indicators established for Part B and 14 for Part C. OSEP reviewed the performance plans and responded to the states within 120 days of the submission of their plans.
Now each state must collect valid and reliable information to report annually to the Secretary on the indicators. If a state collects data on an indicator through state monitoring or sampling, data must be collected for each local program at least once during the period of the state performance plan.
So states will collect data from every local program on each local indicator at least once every 6 years?
That's right, Juliet. And each state must use the targets in its state performance plan to analyze the performance of each local program annually.
How is the information reported, and to whom is it reported?
Each state submits an annual performance report to the department, reporting on its progress based on its targets beginning February 1st, 2007. Each state must also report annually to the public on the performance of each local program on the targets in the state's performance plan.
The states must make their performance plans available to the public, including by posting them on their websites and by disseminating them through the media and through public agencies. Everyone who is interested or involved in this process should be able to see the federal indicators and identify the targets that the state has established. Also, it's important to note that states were encouraged to involve stakeholders in the establishment of their targets.
What happens when the states submit their annual performance reports?
The Secretary annually reviews the performance report, and based on information provided in that report, information obtained through monitoring visits, and any other public information available, determines if the state meets requirements, needs assistance, needs intervention, or needs substantial intervention.
Can I assume that there is some related action on the part of the department based on these determinations?
You can. The actions to be taken are established in the statute and implementing regulations. Of course, there's no action required if a state is meeting the requirements and continues to meet them.
But if the Secretary determines for 2 consecutive years that a state needs assistance in implementing the requirements, the Secretary must take one or more of the following actions. Advise the state of available technical assistance that may help the state. Direct the use of state-level funds under IDEA for the areas needing assistance. And/or identify the state as a high-risk grantee and impose special conditions on the state's IDEA grant award.
If the Secretary determines for 3 or more consecutive years that a state needs intervention in implementing the requirements, the Secretary may take any of the actions that Ruth just mentioned. And the Secretary must take one or more of the following actions. Require the state to prepare a corrective action plan or improvement plan if the Secretary determines that the state should be able to correct the problem within 1 year. Require the state to enter into a compliance agreement under the General Education Provisions Act, or GEPA, if the Secretary has reason to believe the state cannot correct the problem within 1 year. Withhold not less than 20% and not more than 50% of the state's administration funds under IDEA until the Secretary determines the state has sufficiently addressed the areas in which it needed intervention. Seek to recover funds under GEPA. Withhold in whole or in part any further payments to the state under IDEA, and/or refer the matter for appropriate enforcement action. This may include referral to the Department of Justice.
Finally, anytime the Secretary determines that a state needs substantial intervention or that there is a substantial failure to comply with any condition of the SEA or LEA's eligibility under IDEA, the Secretary takes one or more of the following actions. Recovers funds under GEPA, withholds in whole or in part any further payments to the state under IDEA, refers the case to the Department's Office of the Inspector General, or refers the matter for appropriate enforcement action, which may include referral to the Department of Justice.
Within 30 days of taking enforcement action, the Secretary is required to report to Congress on the specific action taken and why the enforcement action was taken.
And when the Secretary takes an enforcement action because a state has been determined to need assistance for 2 consecutive years, need intervention for 3 or more consecutive years, or need substantial intervention, the state must notify the public of pending enforcement action.
These are quite serious actions.
They are, Juliet, and OSEP is taking them very seriously, as are the states. We've been working with the states for nearly 2 years, first to prepare for the submission of the state performance plans, and then for submission of the annual performance reports. OSEP provided a summer institute in 2005 to help states prepare performance plans. Our responses to those plans included written guidance, templates, and monthly national technical assistance calls to further support states.
All of which begin to address the technical assistance part of the requirements.
That's correct. And OSEP state contacts have been talking with their states each month to provide additional support.
Are there additional requirements we haven't mentioned?
There must be an opportunity for a hearing prior to payments to a state being withheld.
Also, the Secretary may determine that withholding payments be limited to programs or projects or portions of programs or projects that affected the Secretary's determination.
And the state education agency must not make any further payments under IDEA to those specified state agencies or local programs.
If a state determines that a local program is not meeting the requirements of IDEA, including the targets in the state's performance plan, the state must prohibit the local program from reducing its maintenance of effort for any fiscal year. The idea here is that full funding is needed to address areas where the local program needs assistance.
A state is not restricted from utilizing any other authority available to it to monitor and enforce the requirements of IDEA. So the monitoring, technical assistance, and enforcement requirements in the statute and final regulations are not the only mechanisms that may be available to states.
So states use the same process with their local programs that OSEP uses with the states in terms of making the determinations.
That's right, Juliet. States must make annual determinations regarding whether their local programs are meeting the requirements using the same categories that OSEP uses for the states.
Also, nothing in the statute or regulations restricts the Secretary from using authority under GEPA to monitor and enforce the requirements of IDEA, including imposing of special conditions.
I certainly see that there is a planned integration of the monitoring, technical assistance, and enforcement.
That's the intent of the law, and OSEP is making every effort to provide as much support as possible to states in implementing the requirements.
OSEP also is working closely with our funded technical assistance and dissemination projects to provide further support to the states. The provisions are serious and represent high stakes for states and local programs, but it is important to focus on the purpose and intent. Improving educational results and functional outcomes for infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities, and ensuring that states and public agencies meet program requirements.
That's a focus we can all appreciate and support. Thanks, Ruth, and thank you, Greg. I appreciate your being here today to talk with us about these important provisions. This video is one in a series prepared by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, to assist our stakeholders in better understanding some of the significant provisions of the final regulations implementing IDEA 2004. We hope you found it helpful, and we thank you for your attention.